Imagine this for a second. It is the year 1498. A single solitary ship anchors off the coast of Calicut.
Right.
And looking at it, it was just a normal ship. But that one arrival completely disrupted the ancient global trade networks. I mean, it literally changed the entire course of Indian history.
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive turning point.
Yeah. And this isn't just history, It's basically a blueprint of how global monopolies are built. So today, we are cutting out all the fluff. We're diving straight into the exact mechanisms, the chronologies, and those really specific previous year question facts you need for the exam.
The really high-yield stuff.
Exactly. We're looking at how European startups essentially conquered an entire subcontinent. So consider this your ultimate revision session on the advent of Europeans in India.
And what's really fascinating here is that the Europeans didn't actually initiate trade in India. I mean, India had been trading with Arabs and Romans since ancient times.
Right. The trade routes were already booming.
Exactly. Okay. But in 1453, the Ottoman Empire blocked the land routes. So the Europeans, they desperately needed a new sea route. And when they finally got here, they didn't just join the trade, they violently redirected it.
Violently. That is the key word there.
Yeah, their main goal was to completely bypass those Arab intermediaries and secure an absolute monopoly.
Exactly the point.
Right.
And understanding the chronology is really the first step here. If we want to understand how India was colonized, we have to look at the sequence of arrivals. Because it wasn't just the British, it was a cutthroat capitalist race.
It really was.
And the pioneers of this race were the Portuguese. You got to remember this, it's a huge point. The Portuguese were the first to arrive and the absolute last to leave.
First to arrive, last to leave. Yeah, they didn't leave until 1961 with Operation VJ.
Right. So Vasco da Gama arrives in Calicut in 1498, and the local ruler, the Zamarin, he actually welcomes him. But Vasco da Gama's intentions were, well, they were pretty clear from the start.
Very clear.
I always think of the Portuguese like this hyper-aggressive, modern startup. Like, they didn't just want a seat at the table to compete.
No, they wanted the whole table.
Exactly. If you look at tech monopolies today, their goal is to control the entire ecosystem. The Portuguese were doing exactly that. They wanted an absolute monopoly, even if they had to use brute military force to get it. I mean, they would just started directly attacking Arab ships.
That startup analogy actually aligns perfectly here. Their approach was hostile from day one. And this whole aggressive expansion was really led by their first governor, Francisco de Almeida.
Right.
He had this very famous strategy, which we call the Blue Water Policy.
The Blue Water Policy, which basically means if you control the ocean, the land automatically falls under your control.
Precisely. Almeida had this clear vision that, instead of building massive forts on land, it's way better to just choke the ocean routes.
Right, cut off the supply lines.
Exactly. If you have superior naval power, you dictate India's trade, period. And to enforce this, they introduced the Cartesian system.
Okay, if you're listening and wondering how this Cartesian system actually worked in real life, think of it as a mix between a mafia protection racket and like a modern software subscription model.
That is a great way to put it.
Right, like you want to trade in the Indian Ocean. Then you have to buy a written pass, the cartais, directly from the Portuguese.
And if you just tried to sail your ship without that cartais, the Portuguese gunboats would literally sink your ship or just confiscate all your cargo.
Wow.
Even the mighty Mughals, I mean, their army was invincible on land, but even they had to buy a cartais when sending ships out because they just didn't have a strong navy.
Which must have been a huge reality check for the Indian rulers. So after Almeida comes Alfonso de Albuquerque, and this is an important point for the notes. He is widely considered the real founder of Portuguese power in the East.
Yeah, Albuquerque shifted the strategy quite a bit. He didn't just focus on the open water. He started capturing these really key strategic choke points. Like in 1510, he captured Goa from the Sultan of Bijapur.
Which was huge.
A massive turning point.
Yeah.
Because suddenly they had a permanent base.
Oh, and here's a really interesting exam fact. He actually abolished sati in the areas he controlled.
And to sustain all this military force, they needed fortified bases. The Portuguese built the very first European fort in India. That was at Cochin in 1503. Fort Emmanuel.
Yep, spot on. And since we are focusing on previous year questions here, we absolutely have to mention their ecological impact.
Oh, absolutely. And listen up, this is a direct UPSC trap. The Portuguese didn't just bring weapons and violence, they totally disrupted agriculture too. Papaya, pineapple, and guava.
Yep.
All three of those fruits were brought to India by the Portuguese. The exam directly asks about this, so do not get it wrong.
Yeah, don't mess that up. Tobacco and cashew nuts, too. They brought all of that from Brazil and South America. They literally changed the landscape of Indian agriculture forever. Okay, so the Portuguese have this violent monopoly set up. Then the Dutch enter the race. They arrive in 1605 and set up their first factory at Masulipatam. But their structure and their agenda were completely different from the Portuguese.
What's really fascinating here is that the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was essentially history's first multinational megacorp.
Right.
But their main focus wasn't actually India at all. They wanted the spice trade, which was centered in the Spice Islands, which is modern-day Indonesia.
Wait, okay, I gotta stop you there. If they wanted spices from Indonesia, why were they setting up factories in India?
It was all about the barter economy. They needed to buy those Indonesian spices, but the Indonesians had zero interest in European goods.
Ah, so they wouldn't take European money or products.
Exactly.
No.
What the Indonesians really wanted were fine Indian textiles, the cotton and the silk. So the Dutch set up this incredibly complex triangular trade. They only built factories in India so they could buy cheap Indian clothes, ship them to Indonesia, and trade them for spices.
Wow. So in their grand master plan, India was literally just a pit stop, just a textile warehouse where the end goal was always Indonesia.
And that is exactly why their territorial ambitions in India just sort of faded away. They violently secured their monopoly on the spice trade and poured all their energy into that.
Makes sense.
So when they eventually clashed with the English forces in India, they just couldn't sustain it. The British absolutely crushed them in 1759 at the Battle of Bidara. After that, the Dutch were practically out of the Indian game.
Okay, let's unpack this sequence. The Portuguese are relying on their naval power and their ocean protection racket. The Dutch are completely distracted by Indonesia. So this vacuum, or this distraction, opens the door for a new, highly organized power. The English.
Yes, the English East India Company, a private enterprise that eventually swallowed an entire empire.
But I have a fundamental doubt here. If the Dutch already controlled the global spice trade, and that's where the massive profits were, how did the English manage to pivot? Like, why didn't the English just fight the Dutch for the Spice Islands right from the start?
Well, because initially they did try to fight them, and they lost badly.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in events like the Amboina Massacre, the Dutch violently eliminated the English traders from the islands.
Wow.
But this actually became the English East India Company's greatest masterstroke, or maybe just forced brilliance. When they realized the Dutch monopoly on spices was unbreakable, they strategically shifted their focus. They abandoned spices and went all in on Indian textiles.
And timing is everything, right? Because back in Europe, industrialization and changing fashions meant the demand for Indian chintz, calico, and silk was just exploding.
Exactly.
So the pivot paid off massively. The East India Company was formed in 1599, and in 1600, Queen Elizabeth I issued a royal charter, giving them a 15-year exclusive monopoly.
But getting into India wasn't a smooth process at all. In 1608, you had Captain William Hawkins arriving at Jahangir's court in Surat. His whole goal was to get permission to build a factory there. Right. But the Portuguese were already entrenched there, and their influence over the Mughal court were really strong. They basically blocked Hawkins completely, and he had to leave empty-handed.
Which just shows that the Moguls really believed the ocean belonged solely to the Portuguese. But then, the game flips in 1612. Captain Thomas Best actually defeats the Portuguese at the Battle of Swally.
And that battle was a huge turning point, because when Jahangir saw that this new European power could just easily dismantle the Portuguese gunboats, he was seriously impressed.
Right, the Mughals suddenly realized the balance of naval power was shifting.
Exactly. And the direct result of that was the English finally getting official permission in 1613 to set up their first permanent factory at Surat.
Important point there, first permanent factory, Surat, 1613. And after that, the English East India Company just did not stop. Their expansion was so methodical. In 1639, they leased Madras from a local ruler, built a fortified settlement there called Fort St. George.
And then there's Bombay, which has to be one of the weirdest real estate transactions in history.
Oh, the dowry thing.
Yes. In 1662, the Portuguese king married his daughter, Catherine of Braganza, to the English King Charles II. And for her dowry, he just gave him the entire island of Bombay.
It's so crazy. The king of one country gives the king of another country a piece of a third country as a wedding gift. And what's even funnier is that King Charles II had absolutely no use for this random, far-off island.
Not at all.
So in 1668, he just leases the island to the East India Company for, like, £10 a year?
I mean, it's £10 back then, but still. The rent for an entire future financial capital. So now the EIC has Bombay in the west and Madras in the east. Very strong footholds.
Right. So after the English, we get the latecomers. Yeah. Danes arrived in 1616. Their main base was Tranquebar, but their primary motive was never really territorial expansion, was it?
No, the Danes were way more focused on religion and missionary activities rather than strict commerce. The Indian market was just so saturated by then they couldn't really compete.
Right. So by 1845, they basically just sold all their settlements to the British and packed up.
Exactly. And then the absolute last to arrive were the French in 1664. They established Pondicherry and Chandigarh. And this is where the narrative gets really, really complex.
Right, because if you imagine the map at this point, you've got all these European powers building their own factories and forts on the exact same coastline, fighting for the exact same resources. Surat, Masulipatam, Hooghly.
Yeah.
Demand is skyrocketing, supply is limited, and prices are surging, so profit margins are just getting totally squeezed.
It was a complete powder keg.
Yeah.
Because when profit margins drop like that, commercial rivalry inevitably turns into political rivalry and eventually war. You literally have to physically remove your competitors from the market to get your monopoly back.
And that right there is the spark for the Carnatic Wars. Listeners, pay close attention here. This is a major UPSC trap. We often just assume that historical wars in India were just local rulers fighting over territory.
Yeah.
But these Carnatic Wars were completely European spillover conflicts. Whenever Britain and France went to war back in Europe, their trading companies in India would drag the local powers into these massive proxy wars.
Yeah, the Carnatic Wars were just the direct, brutal execution of Anglo-French rivalry. Take the First Carnatic War from 1740 to 1748. It had absolutely nothing to do with Indian politics.
Right.
The trigger was the Austrian War of Succession happening all the way over in Europe. And the moment a peace treaty, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was signed in Europe, the war in India just abruptly stopped.
But even in that First Carnatic War, there was this one small battle that essentially defined the next 200 years of history, the Battle of St. Thome. It was a massive eye-opener. But why exactly? What actually happened there?
Well, on one side, you had this tiny French military force, literally just a few hundred trained soldiers. And on the other side, you had Anwar ud-Din, the Nawab of Carnatic, with a massive Indian army of about 10,000 men.
Huge difference.
But the Nawab's army was very traditional. You know, chaotic cavalry charges, war elephants, outdated tactics. The French army, though small, had severe discipline. They were trained in musket volley fire, and they had modern artillery.
And they completely routed them. They proved that 500 properly drilled soldiers firing in sync could completely destroy an army of 10,000. It made it incredibly clear to the Europeans that Indian armies were actually very easy to defeat if you just applied European discipline and tactics.
And that newfound confidence leads directly into the Second Carnatic War, which ran from 1749 to 1754. Now, this one wasn't started by Europe. It was over local dynastic disputes in Hyderabad and the Carnatic.
Right, two different claimants fighting for the throne in both regions.
Exactly. And both European powers basically hijacked this local dispute for their own proxy war. The French supported one claimant, the British supported the rival. And this war gives us one of the most brilliant examples of military strategy. Robert Clive versus the French governor, Duplessis.
Right, and Duplessis was this master strategist, wasn't he? I mean, he basically developed the foundational idea of the subsidiary alliance, finding factionalism among Indian rulers, renting out your European army to them, and extracting massive concessions.
He did. But here's the catch. Duplessis was a brilliant diplomat, but a terrible field commander.
And that is exactly where Robert Clive changed the game. When the French and their ally, Chanda Sahib, were laying siege to the main army at Trichinopoly, Clive didn't just march down there to fight them head-on.
No, he did something crazy.
Right. He takes just 200 soldiers, marches right through a massive thunderstorm, and attacks Chanda Sahib's capital city, Arcot. And he captures it.
It was an absolute masterclass in diversion tactics. To save his capital, Chanda Sahib had to pull his main army away from Trichinopoly, which completely relieved the British allies. Clive held a defensive position, and the entire French strategy just derailed.
Which brings us to the final nail in the coffin. The Third Carnatic War, 1758 to 1763. Once again, directly linked to Europe, this time the 7 Years' War. And the decisive moment here is the Battle of Wandiwash in 1760.
The Battle of Wandiwash. British General Eyre Coote completely defeats the French General Count Tillely. That single battle permanently buried French military and political ambitions in India.
And the war officially ends with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The French did get their factories back, like Pondicherry and Chandernagore, but with a massive
Just a
catch.
huge catch.
They were strictly forbidden from fortifying them, and they had to completely disband their army. They were permanently reduced to just mere traders.
So if we step back and analyze the bigger picture, why did the French actually lose? I mean, they had a visionary like Dupleix, their army was strong. Where did it all go wrong?
That is exactly what I always wonder, because on paper, they had everything they needed to win. Was it purely a funding issue or what?
It was funding, but also structure. There were three critical differences. First, the French East India Company was purely state-owned. The French government directly controlled it. So making decisions took years because a file had to go to Paris, politicians would debate it, and then eventually send an order back.
Whereas the British East India Company was this incredibly agile, private, joint stock company. Guys on the ground, like Robert Clive, could make instant decisions without asking a king.
Exactly. The second reason is that the French basically stopped caring about business. Dupleix' territorial ambitions got so big that he just ignored the actual trade.
Right.
And when your primary function is to be a profitable trading company, but you're only spending money on wars, you're going to go bankrupt.
While the British East India Company was aggressively managing their trade, pulling in massive profits, and using those exact profits to finance their private armies, their venture capitalist model was flawless.
So it brings us to the ultimate question. How does a tiny island nation, England, travel across the world and defeat both the wealthiest European powers and these massive Indian empires? It wasn't just luck. It wasn't just having better guns.
I really think British success was primarily about better accounting and better institutional frameworks. If we list out the absolute key reasons, number one, naval power. The Royal Navy was openly the most advanced and largest navy in the world. They controlled all the ocean supply lines.
Number two, the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. By the 18th century, England's society and production mechanisms were rapidly changing. They had a massive technological edge that gave them better weapons and insane logistical support.
Right. Number three, and this is interesting, a lesser zeal for religion. The Portuguese and Spanish, their mission was to extract wealth, sure, but also to force their religion on people. They literally ran inquisitions.
Very brutal ones.
But the British were totally practical. They didn't care about your religion as long as their revenue kept flowing. And because of that pragmatic approach, local rulers initially saw them as less of a threat.
And number four, military discipline. Yes, they had modern strategy, but the real secret was regular salaries.
Money talks.
Always. A soldier is only loyal if he knows for a fact he's getting paid at the end of the month. Indian armies and French troops mutinied constantly because they would go months without a single paycheck.
But wait, if we're talking about money, we absolutely cannot miss the massive machine that was actually funding all of this, the Bank of England and the debt market. To me, this is the absolute key to their victory.
It is the most fascinating and honestly the most overlooked aspect of this history. War is incredibly expensive. You fight for years, and your treasury just empties out.
Right.
The French government tried to raise money the old, outdated way, raising taxes arbitrarily or begging nobles for loans. And when they ran out of money, well, the French Revolution happened.
But what did the British do? They issued government bonds. The Bank of England created a highly organized debt market where the public and wealthy investors could literally loan their money to the government for a guaranteed interest rate.
They essentially crowdfunded their wars based on the promise of future profits.
That's brilliant.
They never ran out of money. That British soldier was getting his salary on time specifically because the money markets back in London were functioning efficiently. Wars aren't just won on the battlefield. They're won on the balance sheets. The nation with the superior financial system took the subcontinent.
That is just mind-blowing. And if you're prepping for the exam, these analytical differences need to flow directly into your answers. It's institutional advantage over individual brilliance. All right, now it is time to lock these facts in. Time for the rapid revision.
Let's do it.
Let's list closely. First to arrive, Portuguese in 1498. Vasco da Gama at Calicut. First to arrive, last to leave. Remember Almeida's blue water policy and the Cartesian system, the ocean toll booth? Albuquerque captures Goa in 1510. Then the Dutch arrive in 1605 at Masulipatam, but they only wanted spices from Indonesia. India was just a textile pit stop. The British crushed them at the Battle of Badara in 1759, and it's game over for the Dutch. Next, the English East India Company. Charter in 1600. First permanent factory at Surat in 1613. They lease Madras in 1639 and get Bombay as a dowry in 1668. The Danes show up in 1616 but basically just act as missionaries. Finally, the French arrive in 1664, set up Pondicherry. Anglo-French rivalry explodes into Carnatic Wars. First war gives us the Battle of St. Thome, discipline beats numbers. Second war features Robert Clive's brilliant diversion at Arcot. Third war brings the decisive Battle of Wandiwash in 1760. French are out, British supremacy is proven, and why did the British win? Naval power, pragmatism, private corporate structure, and the financial engineering of the Bank of England. Boom, done.
That is the perfect timeline. But before we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Today we saw that the British didn't conquer India solely with cannons and muskets. They conquered it through back-office finance, organized debt markets, and a ruthlessly efficient corporate structure back in London.
Right.
So think about this for a minute. If the French monarchy had established a better central bank at the time, or if the Dutch hadn't been so completely obsessed with the Spice Islands and actually focused on India, would the map of modern India look entirely different today?
Man, really think about that. Go back to that very first ship in 1498. If the power behind that ship had a better accountant or a better venture capitalist mindset, history could have been completely rewritten. Keep revising, connect the dots, and always keep questioning the why behind the history. We will catch you in the next deep dive.